Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this year's HLA Hart Memorial Lecture, and I'm delighted that the lecture will be given by Professor Elizabeth Anderson. We'll hear more about Professor Anderson's extraordinary career in a moment. I'd like to thank Lord Mance for his support. He's unable to be with us this afternoon, and welcome Lady Arden. I'd also like to welcome the members of the Hart family who are joining us this evening. Charlie, Tanya, and Scarlett, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Herbert Lionel Adolphus Hart was Professor of Jurisprudence here at University College between 1952 and 1969, and a Fellow of the College until 1973, when he became Principal of Brasenose College from 1973 to 1978. He was born in Harrogate in 1907 and practiced as a barrister at the Chancery Bar in the 1930s, after which he saw wartime service with MI5 and Bletchley Park. So that tells you what a huge brain he had. Rather than return to practice after the war, he accepted a teaching fellowship at New College, during which he established his reputation as a teacher and scholar. Perhaps best known for the hugely influential work he wrote whilst here at Univ, The Concept of Law, he is considered one of the world's foremost legal scholars of the 20th century. His many wide-ranging publications sit at the nexus of law, philosophy, and politics. The H.L.A. Hart Visiting Fellowship was established here at University College in 2005 in memory of Herbert. In the decade following 2005, some 40 distinguished scholars were awarded the fellowship and enriched the intellectual life of the college and faculty with erudition and scholarly engagement. And I'm so proud that the tradition of jurisprudence and philosophy continues at Univ today. I'm going to hand over to my distinguished colleague, Ruth Chang, who is the Chair and Professor of Jurisprudence here at Oxford and is a Professorial Fellow here at University College. Ruth's relentless energy has made today possible. Ruth, Professor Chang, over to you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's H.L.A. Hart Memorial Lecture and to introduce to you one of today's most distinguished thinkers, Professor Elizabeth Anderson. Liz, as she is known, is the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan. She is one of the most influential moral, political, and legal philosophers of our time, known for her social science-inflected work on equality, democratic theory, social justice, and the ethics of economic life. Let me give you a whirlwind tour through her most famous work. Her groundbreaking article, What is the Point of Equality?, insightfully notes that in order to create a truly equal society where individuals are treated with equal respect and dignity, it's not enough to achieve equality as traditionally understood, that is, sameness in resources, opportunities, or even outcomes. What we need is relational equality in which individuals interact with each other as equals regardless of their background or circumstances, especially given unjust and often seemingly invisible background social structures. In her book, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and What We Can Do About It, she argues compellingly that many of us are governed far more and far more obtrusively by the private government of our employers rather than the public government of the state. In an early work, The Imperative of Integration, she argues that despite progress towards racial equality African Americans remain disadvantaged on virtually all measures of well-being, and that segregation continues to be a key cause of these problems. Racial integration, she thinks, is absolutely needed to address these issues. Her latest book is Hijacked: How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. And it's based on her Seeley lectures down the road at the University of Cambridge. In that book, she argues trenchantly and persuasively that the so-called work ethic has been co-opted by neoliberals to benefit the 1% at the expense of the dignity and standing of the rest of us. It has just been released, and if you hurry, you can get one of the last 6 copies on Amazon UK. Across her prolific career, Professor Anderson has combined deep philosophical insight with real-world urgency, bringing philosophy to bear on the most pressing social questions of our age. She has been and continues to be a passionate advocate for the role of reasoned public discourse in democratic life. Like her doctoral supervisor and mentor, John Rawls, Liz is an incredibly modest and humble person. This is despite her being named a MacArthur Genius Fellow, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, being profiled by the New Yorker magazine, and having 2 honorary degrees. Like Rawls, Liz has reached the pantheon of historical figures in intellectual history, at least from the point of view of undergraduates. An undergraduate once asked a philosophy professor friend of mine, "Did Rawls own slaves?" And I seem to recall someone asking me, "Was Elizabeth Anderson a suffragette?" Please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Anderson as the 39th H.L.A. Hart Memorial Lecture at the University of Oxford.
It's a tremendous honor and delight to address you today as the Hart Lecturer, and some of the things I have to say actually connects to Professor Hart's wonderful work. I'm going to start off with perhaps the greatest question that we face in theoretical normative philosophy, and that is the contest between the 2 great schools in the theory of right. One is consequentialism, and the other is deontological moral theory. And I'll start off with this quote by Christine Korsgaard, who says, "The subject matter of morality is not what we should bring about, but how we should relate to one another." Now, I'm a partisan of the deontological school, and so I agree with Korsgaard that the subject matter of morality is indeed how we should relate to one another. Consequentialists, on the other hand, think that our fundamental duty is to maximize the good. Utilitarians, as a form of consequentialism in the modern era, believe that the good is human welfare, or the welfare perhaps of all sentient beings, and consequently we should maximize that. So there are 3 great differences between these 2 schools of thought. One concerns the question of value. Does welfare matter because people matter intrinsically, or does welfare just matter in and of itself? And here, deontologists say welfare matters only because people matter. People are the fundamental beings that matter, perhaps animals too, but the value of welfare depends on the value of people, and the value of people places independent constraints on what our duties are. Derek Parfit argued famously in Reasons and Persons that the very concept of a person doesn't have fundamental moral significance. We should just maximize the good. The second great dispute between consequentialists and deontologists concerns justification. what principles of interpersonal treatment and regard can we will together? What can we consent to? That's what the deontologists think. The right consists in whatever principles of interpersonal treatment we can generally accept or consent to, right? We have to be consulted because people matter. On the other hand, consequentialists tend to adopt a rational choice theoretic point of view. Each person is expected simply to maximize the good. We all are given the same goal of maximizing the good, impersonally considered. And the third dispute concerns whether there exist non-instrumental moral rules that are constitutive of just and decent relationships. Deontologists say, yes, there are such rules. For example, human rights. Enslaving another person is absolutely forbidden, and you don't have to justify it in terms of some further consequences. So such rules, deontological rules, are things like directed duties, that is, duties of a purely moral sort that I have towards other people, that everyone has to other people, that don't require any further justification in terms of the effects of following those rules. So we have directed duties, and we also have matters of distributive justice, which similarly don't have to be justified in terms of some further consequence that they generate. Now, today what I'm going to discuss is what I'm calling the forgotten political history of utilitarianism. And you might be surprised to learn that utilitarianism was originated by theologians who also invented the Protestant work ethic. And in their hands, these were Calvinist theologians, and consequently they were reasoning from a deontological moral framework. We get our duties by God's command. Okay, we have a duty to obey God, but God also gives us duties to our fellow human beings, and those duties, what we owe to each other, those are directed duties. We have a fully deontological moral framework within which utilitarianism originated. What I'm going to be arguing today is that political economists of the late 18th century and the 19th century turned utilitarianism into a consequentialist doctrine, and that they were moved by the Industrial Revolution and had certain perspectives on it. In particular, they had both a utopian and a catastrophizing and anti-sentimental cast of mind. And it's those attitudes which really drove them to eliminate inherently relational and justice-based concerns from their moral framework. And I'm going to be explaining how that happened. In addition, these political economists rationalized authoritarian and relationally destructive development projects, economic development projects, particularly concerning the poor. So it was mostly in relation to the poor that these political economists dismissed directed duties of the sort that deontologists insisted on in the 17th century version of the Protestant work ethic. So perhaps then we should take a look at the content of the Protestant work ethic and where the origins of utilitarianism come from. So these theologians said that God gave us a purpose in life, and that purpose is our duty to fulfill. Namely, our purpose is to promote human life and well-being. You can see that directly in Locke. That's his fundamental principle of nature. God also provided us means to achieve our purpose. This included, he gave us the earth. All the natural resources are given to us to promote human life and well-being. God also instituted a division of labor to enable us to best help one another. And God also gave each of us a calling, that is, a particular calling to a particular occupation where our skills would be best utilized so as to promote the flourishing of each and every person. Now, of course, these Puritans, they were Calvinists, and consequently, on their view, there's no such thing as supererogation. All permissible acts are duties. That's Article 14 of the 39 Articles of the Church of England. And here's some quotes from these theologians. This is Richard Baxter, probably the premier Puritan theorist of the Protestant work ethic. He said, "Every man must do all the good he can to others." He also pronounced that the good of many is to be preferred to the good of a few. And he demanded of each of us to practice universal charity to each and every person. Another great theologian of the Protestant work ethic compared the God-instituted, divinely instituted division of labor to the interlocking gears of a clock. Sanderson, in a great sermon, Ad Populum, that is still studied today by seminarians in the Reformed Church, he said, "As in a clock, one wheel moveth another, and each part giveth and receiveth help to and from the other, so should it be in the civil body of the state." So the body politic is like the interlocking wheels, the gears of a clock. Each of us is helping everyone else. Every gear is helping the others move along. Sanderson also said, every man has a kind of right and interest in every other man. A right and an interest. Think about that. Baxter said, "It's a prison and a constant calamity to be tied to spend one's life in doing little good at all to others, though he should grow rich." So here it's clear that although the Puritans did advise that between one honest labor and another, you should probably choose the one that makes more money, nevertheless, only if it does more good to other people. And the Puritans also gave us an important ideal of meaningful work. Namely, work has to be helping other people, and that we find our fulfillment and satisfaction in exercising the skills needed to help people in that particular occupation. In other words, what they're suggesting here, that inclination that we need in order to bind us to our calling and ensure that we're zealously committed to pursuing that calling to the end of our laboring days, essentially that amounts to a kind of pleasure in doing our duty because we love exercising those skills. So we can see pretty much in this framework then a kind of deontological utilitarianism. And how do you get that? Well, for one thing, the clock metaphor shows that each person's good is tightly coupled to one's own good. After all, my activity in work can only be meaningful if I really am helping other people, right? So my good, my fulfillment in my occupation only works if I'm really helping other people, advancing their good. And that's really clear with that clock-like division of labor, everybody helping everyone else. We also have here something that evangelicals today call a purpose-driven life. The ideal is that the meaningfulness of my activity is essentially tied to aiming to serve you as God calls us to do. We have Locke, who insists that every particular person must be protected. Each one individually. We're not allowed to sacrifice some for the sake of others. And in Baxter's voluminous text on business ethics, he prescribes a very elaborate moral economy of trade and commerce and employment, in which he insists that there are many non-legal directed duties of just dealing with the poor and desperate. He has an entire chapter in the Christian Directory called Oppression, in which he explains that it is absolutely wrong to take advantage of people's desperation and poverty and to exploit them, their vulnerabilities, just so that you can make more money. So these are directed duties to the poor, to care for them rather than exploit them, even though one might be in a position to exploit them. And Locke, on his part, insisted that the poor actually have a moral title to charity. I want to stress here, and this is a point that Professor Hart made very clearly in a splendid essay he wrote on Bentham and directed duty. He makes it clear that, of course, within a utilitarian framework, you can have legally prescribed directed duties. You make a contract, and then you owe it to that particular person to fulfill its terms. Okay, those are standard. But what a consequentialist like Bentham rejected was the idea that there would be purely moral directed duties. And Hart discussed this in the context of slavery. So for a deontologist, slavery would be absolutely forbidden because it's just totally wrong to enslave another person. You have a duty not to do that. And that doesn't require some further justification. Whereas for Bentham, in his discussion of slavery, he thinks that if each slaveholder only had one slave, probably the gain in welfare to the slaveholder would be exactly offset by the loss to the slave of the slave's welfare. And consequently, if there was a one-to-one match, well, from a utilitarian point of view, one would be indifferent about whether some people were slaves and others masters, because the utilities come out the same. What made slavery wrong was simply the fact that slaveholders typically had more than one slave. And so on net, it's a negative. I want to stress that these Puritans also had some important, what I'll call attitudes, which informed their moral philosophy, which had an important political impact on the development of the work ethic in practice in Britain. So let's consider first the duties of the work ethic. The number one duty, of course, is industry. You have to work really hard. The Puritans had a behaviorist measure of faith. So the only sign that you really have faith and hence are saved is that you are working really, really hard. And one of the reasons that would incentivize people to work really hard is to gain assurance of their salvation. But along with that behaviorist measure really came a kind of contempt for feelings, for sentiments. One of the things the Puritans really despised was people who thought that they could find their faith, be assured of their faith, simply by looking into their hearts. The love they felt for Jesus as their Savior. They didn't have any truck with that idea at all. And that contempt for feelings just spread out throughout their ethic. In addition, today, evangelicals talk about the language of love, and the Puritans took that very seriously, but love didn't mean sentiment or warmth at all for the Puritans. Service, one might say, service to others is the only language of love that counts in their view. And finally, these Puritans were highly suspicious of the able-bodied poor. They thought, well, what are they doing if they're able to work? Why aren't they working? They had a very difficult time grasping the reality of involuntary unemployment, structural unemployment of various kinds. The second major duty of the work ethic is frugality, which today we know as efficiency. You're not allowed to waste any resources. But that amounted to a kind of instrumentalization of practically everything. So rest, for instance, joy, none of this matters intrinsically, but rest, leisure of some kind might be useful if it restores our capacity to work really hard. And so we shouldn't be wasting time. The Puritans were always in a big hurry, very impatient people, and they were mostly impatient with unproductive social and sentimental interaction. They would always ask, well, what is that good for? Get back to work, do something real. And the third duty of the work ethic is asceticism. Right? We shouldn't indulge in luxury. Indeed, we shouldn't have fun. They were notably critical of festivals, Christmas celebrations, just fun for the sake of fun. No, you have to show that it's good for something. Now, it didn't mean, though, that the Puritans denied all pleasures. As I pointed out, you can take pleasure in the exercise of your skills to benefit other people. You're allowed then to take pleasure in instruments that God has supplied you, the natural resources. You can have gratitude to God for having supplied them and enjoy those instruments as instruments. And of course, you can take pleasure in the thought of the eternal communion with God when one is saved. But here on earth, we have to be very efficient and instrumental about practically everything. So what happened with the work ethic in the late 18th and 19th centuries? Well, the Industrial Revolution had a major impact, and the rise of political economy, the science of political economy was designed to explain what was going on with the Industrial Revolution and what we should make of it in moral terms. So the Industrial Revolution did two things that inspired two attitudes of these political economists. On the one hand, we saw historically unprecedented technological and economic growth, quite stunning, really astonishing, and that led to an attitude on the part of the political economists of a kind of utopian hope. And you see magnificent projections of what might be, how much better life could be if we continued this kind of radical economic development. But at the same time that the Industrial Revolution was happening, the welfare rolls, that is, the rolls of people receiving benefits under the poor law, were increasing. Okay, there were more poor people, and families were also dissolving, and political economists were worried about that as well. Men were abandoning their wives and children, and so forth. And that led to a rather opposite attitude, namely a kind of catastrophizing fear of what might happen if the number of poor just swelled without limit. So we have these contradictory attitudes among the political economists that are very important to take into account. Now, who were these political economists and what were they involved with? Well, they all agreed that the practice of the work ethic was critical to economic growth, to well-being, and to poverty reduction. The key disagreements among the political economists were: what are the institutions that best promote and reward the work ethic? And what values, if any, lie beyond the work ethic? That is, suppose we reach a state in which we're as well off as we could be in material terms. Is there some values beyond the work ethic, and what could they be? And essentially what happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution is a dramatic change in the content of the work ethic. So the original model of the work ethic, the Puritan model, assumed that model workers were craftsmen or yeoman farmers. Those would be the model workers. And the interesting thing about these two types of workers is that they both work with their hands and have access to some income from capital. So a typical yeoman, if they didn't own their farm, would have a 99-year lease. That is almost as good as owning it. And so you are actually able to invest in the productivity of the land and reap some rewards from it, some capital income, essentially. And craftsmen, too. Journeymen owned their own tools. Craftsmen owned their own shops. So they're simultaneously capitalists and manual workers. And for these Puritans, then, the idle poor and the idle rich were equally suspect. This is very important. If you read their sermons, they're not only railing against the idle poor who are begging in the streets without a license, they are also railing against the idle rich who are making their money, taking advantage of other people, or engaged in rack renting, that is, setting the rents too high for a farmer to make a living. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, of course, a sharp class divide emerges between capitalists and workers. And so the original work ethic, in which the duties and benefits of the practice of the work ethic were united, because if you also are saving and investing and so forth, you're going to reap the returns of capital, even as a manual laborer. Once you get the Industrial Revolution, the work ethic turns into two different work ethics. One is a work ethic that's advocating the improvement of the prospects of workers, okay? And that retained the traditional Puritan unity of duties and benefits. So the logic here is, well, workers are doing all the work around here. Shouldn't they enjoy all the fruits of their labor? And we have great political economists, such as Adam Smith, who said, human nature is the same regardless of people's class position. If you want people to work harder, you should pay them higher wages or ensure, right, that they have, are reaping the fruits of their labor. And consequently, the logic of the workers' work ethic led to advocacy for self-employment, because if you're self-employed, then you get to keep all of the fruits of your labor, or later on, labor unions, workers' cooperatives, and so forth, that would also help keep the returns to labor high. But they also postulated a value beyond the work ethic, and that value was leisure, fun. Finally, right, it's not instrumentalized anymore. These people thought that fun would be good, that leisure would be good for the workers. It's pleasant, we like it. We don't have to justify it by simply its capacity to restore our ability to labor. The capitalist version of the work ethic, on the other hand, was highly class differentiated. So you have the capitalists, and they get rewarded for basically undertaking what you might call a tutelary dictatorship over de-skilled factory workers, right? That is, that their job is to rule them in the factory in a highly disciplined way to instill the work ethic in those workers. For the middle class, the idea was here, tossing aside entirely Puritan asceticism, the middle class was to be induced to work very industriously through conspicuous consumption. Start emulating your neighbors and showing off your goods, and that will spur people to work harder to show that they're better than their neighbor by the luxuries that they can show off. For the working class, much more suspicion of them, ordinary factory workers. The idea was that they would quit working if wages were too high. As soon as they covered the subsistence of their family, they would quit. So you should really keep wages low. That was the idea, and not allow them to be self-employed. And finally, for the paupers, the solution was forced labor. I think this is the context in which we can understand a Little Red work by Jeremy Bentham. So here's Bentham, and perhaps his most famous depiction, stuffed and on display in a case in University College London. He did that. He had his body preserved in this way in order to teach the general public that there was nothing to fear from dissection. There was a great shortage of bodies to dissect, to teach surgeons how to practice surgery. And so he's trying to show people, don't be afraid of, having your body be donated to science, which will advance the general utility. Bentham wrote a work, little read, called Pauper Management Improved by the Panopticon Principle. He wrote it in 1797, had it reprinted in 1812. He never left the doctrine behind. And what did he advance? Some doctrines, actually, that are pretty familiar today. One is the idea that the private for-profit sector is way more efficient than government, and consequently public functions should be outsourced to for-profit providers, something that Britain is quite familiar with, that argument. It's Bentham's argument. They're just way more efficient. They got incentives. They'll save taxpayers' money. Well, at the same time, though, Bentham also argued, he defended what we call today the criminalization of poverty. If you see poor people who are shiftless, unemployed, maybe doing irregular things or suspect things like fortune telling, they should be arrested and imprisoned by a private for-profit company which has won an auction to administer the country's poor law, poor relief. And his idea was the private for-profit company would have a license to arrest any person who looks like a vagrant or shiftless in some way. And then they would be arrested and put in a giant prison where they would be forced to work. It was a kind of forced inculcation of the work ethic based on the presumption that if they don't have a steady job, it must be because they lack the work ethic. Bentham was wildly enthusiastic about this project, and he claimed that the adults who would be imprisoned by the system would yield profits of 200 to 300%, but he said the major profits would come from child labor of orphans and children of paupers who were also put in these panopticons. He also recommended experimentation on economizing on children's diets. The panopticon owner would be penalized if any child were left to starve to death, but you could experiment bringing down the cost of the food to the minimum so as not to waste a little jot of corn or what have you. And remarkably, given all of this seemingly horrific proposal, Bentham called his project a romance, a utopia. And this was in response to moral panic over increasing welfare rolls. This project will really take care of it, and then we can have an optimistic view of the future. So essentially what we see here is what I'll call utopian totalitarianism, right? So here's Bentham's famous illustration of this panopticon prison. It's a circular prison, like a donut, observation tower in the middle, so that each individual who's isolated in their own cell could be observed from the windows of the tall tower. And of course, the prisoners wouldn't know at what time they were being observed, but they would control themselves and impose self-discipline because, well, they might be observed and then they could be punished if they were behaving badly. Bentham said no portion of time should be directed exclusively to comfort. There's that harsh Puritanism, no fun, no luxury, right? He said, not a step, not a wink, but might be turned to account in the way of profit. My favorite example of this, he goes on giving examples, but my favorite example of this is he's wondering what to do with people who we would call today have Parkinson's, trembling hands. What can you do? Well, you could put those people in charge of rocking the cradles of the newborns. right? Everything has an instrumental purpose. And indeed, everything else is multi-purpose too. So people would pretty much stay in their cells if they weren't out farming, but their factory work would actually just be within the cell, their manufacturing labor. Everything, the same isolation cell, he insisted, could be used for work, sleep, and worship. And in this system, people wouldn't have family. Children wouldn't be able to see their parents. There were no friends, no community. And Bentham, in his very Puritan, anti-sentimentalist way, insisted that orphans would never miss these things, having never experienced them in the first place, so there's no loss of utility in isolating the children. Here's another famous example of how political economists were thinking about, who were pushing this utilitarian doctrine in a highly consequentialist direction. And this arises in the Irish famine. Poverty relief, food relief was administered by the British Treasury in London. And essentially the thinking was, by parliamentarians at the time, was to not let a calamity go to waste. So what was the idea that lay behind British policy during the Great Famine? Well, from 1845 to 1952, the theory was that relief should be designed in such a way as to modernize Irish agriculture on a more efficient English capitalist system. What that meant was essentially clearing the estates of so-called lazy Irish peasants who supported their families on a quarter acre growing potatoes. You could actually do this. A quarter acre of potatoes could feed a very large family. The Irish at the time were actually probably the best nourished people in Europe because potatoes are amazingly nutritious. And it took very little work to grow potatoes. You just stick potato pieces in the ground and more potatoes grow. And they thought, therefore, the Irish were lazy because they were producing such abundant food on so little labor. And these British in London, the parliamentarians, also had contempt for the purportedly unenterprising, lazy Irish landlords. And so the idea was you should put the cost of relief on the Irish landlords in the hope that they would be driven into bankruptcy so that the more efficient capitalist landlords who didn't allow peasants to grow their own food, but were reduced to agricultural day laborers who had to work for a wage for every calorie, that would be more efficient, they'd be more productive, and so get rid of those lazy Irish landlords by putting the cost of poverty relief on them, which they wouldn't be able to bear during the famine, and then English enterprising capitalist landlords would take over from them. During this period, a notorious provision known as the Gregory Clause was adopted, and this made relief conditional on peasants giving up their quarter-acre plots, so they could no longer support their families, and their rude cottages were also torn down, creating a massive homelessness problem. They also put the burden of poverty on local workhouses, which were not as nice as those panopticons, and too few to support all of the starving poor of Ireland. And so when even men started succumbing to starvation during the famine, the widows and children that were occupying the Irish workhouses were expelled in order to put men to the severe test, the workhouse test, on suspicion that they were malingering, and they really could work, but of course, if they had to enter the workhouse, which entailed giving up all of their civil liberties, that would show that they really couldn't work. Of course, that led to a mass homelessness problem of the most vulnerable people, among them the widows and the children. Landlords also adopted a policy of evicting peasants from the land if they took in starving relatives who themselves had been evicted. Probably the most famous observation made of this policy was made by Benjamin Jowett, the master of Balliol College, who was communicating with Nassau Senior, one of the advocates of these very harsh policies towards the poor. And he recalled in a letter to another person that Senior had told him that he feared that the famine would not kill more than 1 million people, scarcely enough to do any good. Okay, well, there we have it. A combination of utopian theorizing and catastrophizing about being overrun by the poor, especially lazy Irish poor, led to the abolition of directed duties, the expulsion from the original utilitarian system of the Puritans into a much harsher doctrine that rationalized the sacrifice of some for others. Well, one can ask then, look, in defense of these utilitarians, of utilitarianism as a theory, one could say, but look, it's clear here that these harsh ideas of Bentham imprisoning the poor and of the Irish famine relief just got the utility calculations wrong. And of course, the fact that people might make mistaken applications of a theory do not undermine that theory. Now, as a matter of fact, it's not that obvious that the calculations these people made were mistaken in their own terms. And the reason for that is more people, more Irish, actually ended up going to the United States, Canada, and Australia than actually starved, literally starved, in Ireland. And lo and behold, it turned out that those Irish who emigrated to other English-speaking countries actually ended up having pretty wildly successful lives. Well, if you're just going to tot up the utilities, it's not obvious that these utilitarians got the utilities wrong. Maybe in the end, it did the Irish good to basically force them to emigrate from the country. So I would say that the real problem here is that the terms themselves of this consequentialist utilitarianism are morally objectionable. Look, the idea that deliberately cruelty to some just so that more can have much better lives, that's just a wrong principle. Deontologists really don't hesitate to say that that is wrong. Another thing that I think highlights the shocking nature of these proposals, which were the Irish famine ones were actually enacted, is that they imposed a de facto death penalty for acts of charity between destitute kin. That is, you yourself would be evicted and probably starve to death if you took in a family member who had already been evicted. And so as a result, many of these family members who came begging at their cousins' doors or their uncles' doors and so forth were treated very harshly by people who were themselves traumatized and barely surviving. But in some cases, young boys would be beaten up and left to die rather than taken in because of the horrible desperation of everyone during the famine. There's another possibility here, which was pursued by John Stuart Mill, and namely to save the utilitarian principle by enriching one's concept of the good. So John Stuart Mill famously, in his autobiography, described how his completely intellectual upbringing under strict Benthamite utilitarian principles, in isolation from his peers, he didn't have friends growing up. What was the use of that, after all? There were things to learn. That led to his mental crisis as a young adult, and he recovered himself by reading romantic poetry, which brought him to tears, and he recognized that he had a real foundation in moral sentiment in him. He wasn't just a utilitarian machine or what we would call robot today. So here we can see a deep contrast between Mill and Bentham. Mill criticized Bentham for his failure to grasp that we are capable of higher pleasures, and many of those pleasures, our higher pleasures, are vested in our moral sentiments. Things like having a moral conscience, ideals of human excellence, ideals of autonomy, of sympathy, of self-respect, dignity, and loving relationships. So Mill is actually humanizing utilitarianism by pushing against Bentham's idea that all pleasures are identical, so you could make up to the orphans the fact that they're isolated from other people by giving them candy. Right? Mill absolutely rejected that. And Mill also, very much against Bentham, Bentham, the anti-sentimentalist Puritan, denounced the invocation of moral feelings as a ground for any kind of moral action, and Mill himself said that was tyrannical. Bentham said appeals to moral sentiment were tyrannical, and Mill said, well, denouncing moral sentiments as tyrannical is itself tyrannical. People care about things like their conscience and moral ideals. So Mill then ended up trying to save the utilitarian principle by enriching the good. Higher pleasures then are pleasures in non-hedonic values such as beauty. He insisted on the importance of the feeling of unity with others and cooperation on shared goals. And essentially what he's doing is restoring the Puritans' clock. Right, the tight coupling of the good for oneself and the good for others. And he insisted also, this is one of my favorite quotes of Mill, that the only school of genuine moral sentiment is society between equals. And that society between equals requires that the interests of all are to be consulted. What does it mean to consult the interests of all? Keep in mind that Mill was an anti-paternalist, so the only way to actually determine what one's interests are is to ask people what their interests are. They have the last word on what their interests are. And consequently, the value of autonomy for Mill implies that we have to consult with the people who have those interests when we're making decisions that affect them, and that is functionally equivalent to the social contract doctrine. That, of course, is the friendly home of deontological moral theorists. Mill also had a heterodox conception of the good that incorporates deontological rules as constitutive of just and equal relationships. And in the very famous article by H.L.A. Hart, he argues, I think correctly, that when you read Mill very carefully, you can't really fit it into an orthodox consequentialist picture. I think he's absolutely right about this. Mill is so heterodox, he's leaving the consequentialism behind. And one way to think about this is that when you conceive of Mill's talk about the interests of humanity as a progressive being, you leave very little room left for a kind of independent, purely quantitative calculation, such as what might find in public policy cost-benefit analysis today, because all of those quantities have to be strongly constrained by the deontic rules of directed duties that are not necessarily legal duties. So what am I saying here? Well, I actually want to make a plea for the force of genealogical arguments. What I've suggested here, I'm casting Bentham in a rather negative light. I think he deserves that. And arguing that certain morally objectionable attitudes, catastrophizing, utopianism that disregards the interests of each particular person for the sake of just a larger aggregate, that those attitudes are highly problematic, and so we should worry about the validity of doctrines that are expressing those attitudes. So my thesis then is that consequentialist utilitarianism arose from strategies of some political economists to come to terms with the perceived promise and perils of the Industrial Revolution, and they were doing so from the capitalist work ethic point of view, this class-differentiated work ethic. And what we see is that opposing political economists, such as John Stuart Mill, who very clearly adopted the workers' work ethic, incorporated deontic constraints into their utilitarian framework, and thereby partially returned to its Puritan deontological origins. Now, one might object in this case, which is a standard objection that philosophers give to genealogical arguments, is that it's possible to distinguish the rational force of an argument from the circumstances that make people with a certain cast of mind find those arguments compelling. Right? The genealogical argument is trying to explain why people with a certain anti-sentimentalist, Puritan, instrumentalizing cast of mind would find arguments for Bentham's panopticon and ruthless Irish famine relief policies compelling. The catastrophizing, the utopianism, right, and shutting off any sense, the sentiments for the poor, starving Irish, especially those sad orphans. And what I would reply, and I think Mill replies similarly, is that, well, people with a different cast of mind, right, people like Mill himself, who takes the moral sentiments seriously and sees them as sources of moral insight, do not find those wholly consequentialist arguments which hard-heartedly accept that some must be sacrificed for a greater happiness of many more people. They don't find those arguments compelling. They reject British policy during the Irish famine, as indeed Mill rejected it in his writings about the famine. They find it hard-hearted and cruel, and deny that some should be sacrificed, especially that the vulnerable should be sacrificed for the sake of a larger total happiness. And what I would suggest to you in thinking about the value of genealogical arguments and what I've offered here as the forgotten political history of utilitarianism is that beyond the question of first-order moral theorizing about like what principles we should accept, maybe it is something we ought to do to consider what kind of person would accept this principle or that principle, and what kind of person do I really want to be? And so that's why I think genealogical arguments have some force, because it's not just our intuitions about first-order moral principles, but it's also ideals of the kind of moral person one wants to be that play a very important role in determining what moral principles of the first order are acceptable. So that's my lesson that I'm giving to you, and I am open to comments, objections, and questions. Thank you.